Canada. They are the Community Climate Hub's manager. And I believe I made, Mahip, I believe I made you co-host.
Yes, yes, you did.
Perfect. So you can share your screen if you have a presentation.
Yes, I can. 1 second.
Perfect.
Yeah, this goes. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you great. And we can see your presentation. Wonderful.
No spoilers. Thanks so much, Amy, and thank you all for having me here today. And I also just wanted to start off first by thank you for such a great land acknowledgement. I think sometimes it can be difficult to do that in our virtual Zoom reality. So that's great to hear that we're centering this conversation. So as Amy mentioned, my name is Mahip Sandhu. I am the Community Climate Hubs Manager at the Climate Reality Project. So I'll talk a little bit more about what that program is in a bit. But first I wanted to also acknowledge that I'm joining you from Chukchoge, which is otherwise known as Montreal, the unceded traditional land of the Gananoque and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Although I originally am from Southern Ontario, like many of you, from Brampton, which is the land of the Mississaugas of the New Credit. And I grew up actually not too far from the Credit River, which really was where part of my interest in the environment and climate started. The Credit River, as some of you might know, is named after the traditional trade practices that occurred between early settlers and the Indigenous peoples of what we now call the Greater Toronto Area. But the Mississaugas of the New Credit, I think, have a lot of teachings that I've been happy to learn over the years. And then also I spent a lot of time in Ottawa in the traditional unceded lands of the Anishinaabe Algonquin peoples. So I also just wanted to acknowledge that as well. I think when it comes to doing work that's at the intersection of climate change and justice, it's important to look at Indigenous knowledge that has helped to guide ecological sustainability and practices that are not necessarily extractive in their origin. So that's, I wanted to start by saying that. And today I'll be talking to you about cities, which are really the front line of climate action for me and many others, including municipalities as well of any size. That is what I work on day and night. So I'm really excited to hop into the meat of this and really talk about what you can do as community advocates in your own communities. Just so you know, because I'm sharing my screen, I can't see the chat right now. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in and I'll check at the end of the presentation. So today I wanted to give you a bit of a brief overview of what the Climate Reality Project is, and in addition to our other programs, and then take a little bit of a deep dive into the community climate hubs. So let's do that. First, I wanted to mention our leadership core. So the Climate Reality Project was founded in 2007 by former US Vice President Al Gore during a political context and time when educating people about the realities of climate change was a real kind of struggle and area of focus. Now we've evolved really into talking about climate solutions and how everyday people can organize together and bring about the sustainable and resilient world that we are all seeking to build. So we are part of a global community of climate reality branches. There are about 42,000 climate reality leaders around the world. These are folks who've taken time out of their day and sometimes, especially before COVID, find other places to really be in a big community and learn about the realities of climate change, even if they didn't know much going into it. Now, with the post-COVID realities, a lot of our trainings are available online, and you can find more information about that on our website, climatereality.ca. In Canada, we have a big network of about 1,600 leaders, and that was really the origin point for our organization. But individuals and supporting them is only one piece of the puzzle. Being able to assist people in organizing collectively towards climate solutions is always a great way to bring about change. So before I dive into my program, I'll talk briefly about some of the other work we do. So our Campus Core program helps empower young people and students on university campuses, where they can often work on things like a university's integrated plans to bring about changes and also look at curriculums and education about climate change in general. And then we also have our national campaigns. We actively take part in various national and regional coalitions bringing about education and awareness around different policy campaigns and initiatives, from both things that are more grounded in energy transitions to looking at ecological conservation and sustainability, and climate justice, of course, as well. One thing of note that will be useful for many of you is the launch of our National Climate League, which is an exercise in citizen-led democracy and open data. This is essentially a report that has compiled data from cities across Canada, measuring different indicators from climate justice to air quality and access to green space. That will be launching on March 17th, and you can also find that on our website. Now, diving into the Community Climate Hubs, that is the program that I am really happy to run at Climate Reality, which is essentially a support network for community-based groups. I'll be able to talk about more of the nuts and bolts about the program in a second, but first I'd love to frame the conversation by talking a little bit about why cities and towns are the front line of climate change. Within a global context, municipalities, specifically cities, consume almost 80% of the world's energy and produce more than 60% of greenhouse gas emissions, according to UN Habitat. This is really significant considering that 80% of the world doesn't live in cities, although in Canada, that is the case. Concentrations of people, businesses, infrastructure means that cities and the planning processes that go into them often impact the many of our day-to-day emissions. And when we talk about the solutions to climate change, cities are really oftentimes an area that are not put at the forefront of conversation. A large part of that is because we have our federal government and then we have our provincial government, and municipalities are actually considered to be creatures of provinces. So they exist tied into this whole big system of policy. And that means that local advocacy from the ground up can oftentimes get much more done when it comes to city level planning than top-down governance can. Oftentimes though, the best results are when you have the perfect mix of national funding programs, provincial regulations, and community-led advocacy for solutions, whether it be electrified transit or zoning walkable neighborhoods, or ensuring that the city's procurement process is in line with its sustainability goals. Climate change as well is something that's going to be impacting cities, especially more and more as time passes. As we've already seen, both in Canada and around the world, there are increasing concerns around issues of air quality, temperatures, especially heat spike shocks, and disaster risks such as flooding, fires, tornadoes, and all these other really scary impacts of climate change that are occurring. However, every time communities get impacted by these and have to rebuild, provides an opportunity to build a more resilient future that can allow community members to know that they're building back their communities in a way that is safe and climate friendly. That is a policy decision that needs to be made and often is made without citizens at the table. So that's one thing that we try and work on, is ensuring that regular people have access to public consultations and have the support resources they need to organize campaigns and make their voices heard collectively. The next thing that I wanted to highlight was about the economy more specifically. Some folks think that the environment and the economy are two entirely separate realms, but the reality is they are very closely intertwined. The fact is that if we develop a good climate policy across the board, it will allow us to have a smoother economic transition to the climate future that we deserve and want to have. However, climate change is happening, like it or not, to some degree. And that means that communities also need to ensure that their advocacy is around adapting to the impacts of climate change, whether that be coastal communities preparing for rising sea levels, or communities that oftentimes have building codes that are outdated, preparing for temperature shocks or potential changes in supply of fossil fuels for heating, for example. The last thing is that there are a lot of other issues facing folks in cities and towns across the country, whether it be the impacts of urban sprawl, car-centric planning, or housing unaffordability. These are all challenges that have significant impacts on people's everyday lives. And as was mentioned in the video at the start of our conversation today, they present an opportunity to multi-solve, to find solutions that can help us both develop resilient and connected communities, and also solve climate change at the same time. So before I dive into our program specifically, there's a lot of generic best practices that can be taken up by community-based advocates across the board. So I'd love to share some tips and tricks about making change in your city or town. So the first one is organizing your neighbors, your coworkers, community members, and this is really just the human aspect of organizing that is the core of any successful campaign or initiative. Sometimes this can be difficult, especially given the current context around COVID-19, but oftentimes good organizing starts with just a couple people having a conversation about the things that are on their mind and realizing that together we're able to develop education campaigns, talk to our decision makers, and realize that we have power in numbers. And ultimately, that is the most democratic thing that we can do. The other thing that I wanted to highlight was the ability to enact change through policy. So oftentimes, decision makers are told by their constituents that they have a concern about one thing or another. Maybe it's climate change in general. Oftentimes, if you go to decision makers with potential solutions, that allows for that conversation to turn from one of expressing concern into one of working together towards solving the issues that we face in our communities. So pairing data and case studies of successful policies modeled in other places is a great way to enact change. And also, the more local it can be to your community, the better. For example, let's say Mississauga is doing something great around EVs and charging infrastructure. Maybe if you live in Oakville or Brampton, that would be the best example to look at because they're right next door. And when it comes to resources for that, our National Climate League, which is again being launched on March 17th, is a great starting point for understanding which cities are doing great things with examples of winner cities on 14 different indicators. The next tip I have for you is to develop strategic relationships with other groups. Oftentimes, coalitions of community groups can accomplish things that are much greater than working alone, whether that's housing advocates, working with climate orgs to look at the impacts of the energy transition and the costs of gas on renters in a city. That's a great example of an organizing tactic that's been done successfully in some Canadian cities. The other thing is working with cultural groups. Oftentimes in climate organizing, it's difficult for folks to reach outside of their typical social circles and talk to other cultural communities that they live alongside. Sometimes that just means engaging meaningfully with their issues and their concerns and understanding that if you're there for one community-based group, they'll be there for you when it's time to call together your coalition and push together a proposal or a change to your council. The next thing is finding your council champion. So oftentimes on city councils, there are folks who care about climate change, who care about justice, and who want to bring about a better future. But sometimes there's not necessarily enough of a push from the public for them to really know where to put their energy. So figuring out who on your council is a great listening ear for a campaign is a great first step to realizing which directions your energy is best used. One great resource for this is through one of our partner organizations, the Climate Caucus. They have a network of over 400 elected officials across the country that have signed on and joined a group of other elected officials that say, we wanted to enact real climate action in our community. Developing a relationship with local councillors is a great way to build trust and make sure that their ambition is maintained from campaign all the way to council legislating. And then also holding them accountable through when decisions might be tough, when budget seasons come around, and when other priorities are on the table. Because at the end of the day, the solutions to climate change are intersectional, and figuring out creative ways to make them work in your community is a great way to ensure you're building a resilient future for yourself and future generations. And the last thing is know how to tell your story and celebrate your successes. Through traditional media, looking at contacting your local newspaper, or social media, which has exploded in use in the last few years, you can really be able to showcase great examples of action in your community and make it so people in your community take pride in the work you've done. And of course, face-to-face, talking to your neighbors and letting them know about the things that you're passionate about, the campaigns you've worked on, the different organizing you've done is a great way to build up that momentum and create more of a public consensus for ambitious climate action in line with the science. Just a final note on this that I'll say is that I had the honor of representing Climate Reality Project Canada at the COP26 negotiations in Scotland in November. And at that convening place, it was clear that cities are oftentimes the ones in countries, even countries that seem to be lacking ambition. Oftentimes there are mayors and councils and community members like yourselves that are driving forward some of the most exciting change that's happening. So even if you might feel despair with higher levels of government or with decisions that have been taken, being able to organize is oftentimes one of the best antidotes to climate anxiety or other feelings around the impacts of the climate crisis. So next, I would love to just quickly touch on the Community Climate Hubs program. So we have a network across the country of about 24 hubs. And these are essentially community-based groups that we provide a support service to. So we help connect them with decision makers. We help train them on things like volunteer recruitment and how to build a website. And we do this through our network of regional organizers. So our regional organizers also find out opportunities and build coalitions with other partner organizations across the country. Our theory of change really is that the best action is that which comes up from the ground. Participatory democracy is the principle that our democracy exists not just on election day, but every other day of the year. And that allows us to make an enduring change where community members can build up the strong coalitions they need to deliver the change that we want and deserve and that future generations demand. So that's my call to action for all of you today. Is if you are interested in either joining a community climate hub, starting an organization of your own, or reaching out to any of the other fantastic organizations here today at this conference, I'd encourage you to do so. And if you'd like to connect with me, you can do so on LinkedIn or my email. I'll put it in the chat. And the last thing I'll say is you can also find plenty of ways to get involved by following us on our social medias. So I've put the handles here. And if it's easier, you can just hold up your phone and scan any of these